The millionaire was dying in seat 12A, and 43 passengers just watched. But when the only person willing to save her life knelt down in that airplane aisle, the flight attendant's next words would expose the ugliest truth about who gets to be a hero in America. What happened in the next 12 minutes didn't just save Elena Whitford's life. It shattered everything three people thought they knew about family, race, and what happens when a single father's moment of courage destroys the very system designed to keep people like him in their place. But the real shock came 3 days later in a Nashville hospital room, when Elena whispered 7 words that would change a 10-year-old girl's life forever. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now back to our story. This is the story of Marcus Dillard, a black single father whose $42,000 annual salary barely covered what Elena Whitford spent on her Tesla payments. This is about Elena, a tech consulting millionaire with a $47 million empire built on the foundation of childhood abandonment. And this is about 10-year-old Naomi, whose brilliant mind was about to witness her father make a choice that would transform their ordinary life into something extraordinary. United Airlines Flight 2847 from Chicago to Atlanta. February 14th, 11:47 p.m. A storm raging outside that would pale in comparison to the storm about to erupt inside the cabin when prejudice collided with compassion at 30,000 feet. Elena's Hermes handbags scattered across the airplane floor, credit cards spilling like confetti at a funeral nobody wanted to attend. Her unconscious body crumpled in the aisle while passengers whispered their assumptions and calculated their discomfort. But Marcus Dillard saw something different when he looked at that collapsed woman. He saw someone's daughter. Someone's child who needed help when everyone else chose comfort over courage. If you were surrounded by 43 passengers who turned away while someone potentially died, would you risk everything to help? What would you choose when doing the right thing could expose you to the very prejudice you've spent years protecting your child from? What happened next would prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in America is be black and helpful at the same time, and sometimes that danger is exactly what changes everything. Elena Whitford hadn't always been rich. She hadn't always lived in a $3.2 million penthouse in Chicago's Gold Coast, or driven cars that cost more than most people's houses, or commanded boardrooms where Fortune 500 executives hung on her every word. Growing up in Detroit's 8 Mile district, she'd watched her mother, Carmen Whitford, scrub floors at the Renaissance Center from 5 a.m. to 11 p.m., 6 days a week. Carmen cleaned the offices of automotive executives who made in one day what she made in 3 months. Elena would sit in the hallway after school, doing homework on the cold marble floors while her mother emptied trash cans and vacuumed carpets in offices with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Detroit River. "Baby, you see these men in their fancy suits?" Carmen would whisper during her 15-minute break, exhaustion heavy in her voice after another 16-hour shift. "They don't get their hands dirty like we do. But that doesn't make them better than us. Just means they forgot where they came from." But Elena's father, Robert Whitford, had forgotten more than where he came from. When Elena was barely 9 years old, he walked out on a Tuesday morning while she was eating cereal and watching cartoons before school. The last thing Elena heard him say was to her mother in the kitchen, "I didn't sign up to raise a kid who's never going to amount to anything, Carmen. Look at her, she's too soft for this world. She'll never survive what's coming." Those words carved something deep into Elena's soul, a hollow, aching space where fatherly love should have lived, filled instead with a desperate need to prove that she wasn't too soft, that she could survive anything, that she was worth staying for. "Men don't stick around when things get hard, baby," Carmen would tell Elena years later, when the bills piled up and the apartment got colder each winter. "You can't depend on nobody but yourself in this world." That abandonment didn't just break Elena's heart, it became her fuel. By age 16, she was working 3 part-time jobs while maintaining a 4.0 GPA. By 18, she'd earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University. By 22, she'd graduated summa cum laude with degrees in computer science and business administration. And by 32, she had built Whitford Consulting from her studio apartment into a tech empire that stretched from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. Her client list read like a Fortune 500 directory. Apple paid her $2 million to optimize their supply chain algorithms. Goldman Sachs brought her in for $3.5 million to redesign their risk assessment protocols. Tesla hired her for $4.2 million to streamline their manufacturing processes. She commanded rooms where she was often the only woman, frequently the youngest person, and almost always the smartest. Success had become her armor against the wound her father left behind. Every deal she closed, every million she earned, every boardroom she dominated was Elena screaming at an empty chair, "Look at me now, Daddy. Am I still too soft? Am I still not worth staying for?" But armor, no matter how expensive or well-crafted, never heals the places where love was supposed to grow. It only covers them. Elena lived in a world of luxury that would make kings jealous. A penthouse with smart glass windows that could become opaque with voice commands, a wine collection worth more than most people's retirement funds, art on her walls by painters whose names appeared in history books. She could fly anywhere in the world on 3 hours' notice, buy anything that caught her eye, and make phone calls that moved millions of dollars with single sentences. Yet every morning, she woke up in a bed that cost $40,000 but felt empty. Every evening, she came home to silence that echoed through rooms designed by award-winning architects. Every holiday, she worked instead of visiting family because the family that mattered had walked away when she was 9 years old. "Mom, one day I'll own a company that helps people," Elena had promised at her mother's graveside 5 years earlier, rain mixing with tears on her cheeks. Carmen had died of breast cancer at 58, worn down by decades of cleaning other people's messes while dreaming of something better for her daughter. Elena had kept that promise. Whitford Consulting didn't just make money, it helped companies become more efficient, more profitable, more successful. But somewhere along the way, helping others had become more about proving her worth than healing her wounds. Success became an addiction, and like all addictions, it demanded more and more to satisfy the same hunger. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away in Atlanta's Bankhead neighborhood, Marcus Dillard was fighting different battles with the same kind of quiet determination. At 38, Marcus worked 2 jobs that bookend his days like parentheses around exhaustion. Morning shifts started at 4 a.m. as part of Hartsfield-Jackson Airport's ground crew, loading luggage, directing planes, working in Georgia heat that could melt asphalt and Atlanta cold that cut through the thickest jackets. Evening shifts ran until midnight doing maintenance at the Bankhead Community Center, mopping floors, fixing broken equipment, and setting up chairs for AA meetings and GED classes. 16-hour days, 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year. It wasn't the life Marcus had imagined when he was young and full of dreams about becoming a teacher, maybe coaching high school basketball, making a difference in kids' lives the way Coach Patterson had made a difference in his. But dreams have a way of adjusting to reality, and Marcus's reality had been shaped by systemic barriers that seemed designed to keep people like him small, struggling, and grateful for whatever scraps of opportunity fell their way. Still, Marcus never complained. Not after breast cancer took Naomi's mother, Keisha, 3 years ago, leaving him to raise their daughter alone. Not when medical bills from Keisha's treatment ate up every penny of their savings and forced them to move from their small house into a 2-bedroom apartment where the heat didn't always work and the neighbors upstairs played music too loud. Not when he had to explain to 7-year-old Naomi why Mommy wouldn't be coming home from a hospital, why their world had suddenly become smaller and quieter and infinitely more fragile. "Daddy, why did Mommy have to go away?" Naomi had asked during those first awful weeks, her small voice breaking Marcus's heart into pieces he didn't know how to put back together. "Sometimes, baby girl, God needs the best angels to help him take care of other people," Marcus had whispered, holding her while she cried. "Mommy's not really gone. She's just in a place where she can't hug us anymore, but she can still love us." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was honest, and honesty was something Marcus believed in even when the truth was painful. Naomi Dillard was everything Marcus wasn't allowed to be as a child growing up in a world that expected black boys to be tough, quiet, and grateful for limitations disguised as opportunities. She was curious, fearless, brilliant in ways that made Marcus's chest swell with pride and terror in equal measure. While other kids her age played video games and watched YouTube, Naomi devoured library books about space exploration, ocean biology, and environmental science. She built intricate Lego models of coral reefs and solar systems, asked questions that made librarians scramble for encyclopedias, and dreamed of becoming a marine biologist who would discover new species in the deepest parts of the ocean. "Daddy, did you know there are fish that live so deep in the ocean they make their own light?" she'd ask, eyes wide with wonder as they walked through the Georgia Aquarium on one of Marcus's rare days off. "They're called anglerfish, and they have this little light hanging in front of their heads like a fishing pole. The ocean is so dark where they live that they have to create their own brightness to survive." Marcus would smile, remembering his own childhood dreams that got buried under the weight of survival and the quiet violence of low expectations. "Tell me more about these fish, baby girl." Well, the female anglerfish are the ones with the lights. The males are much smaller and they attach themselves to the females for life. And you know what's really cool? The babies stay close to their parents until they're strong enough to make their own light. They're actually really good parents, even in the darkest places in the world. Marcus would nod. Struck by the metaphor, he knew his daughter was too young to fully understand but old enough to sense. They were living in one of those deep, dark places where you had to create your own light to survive. And Marcus was determined to be the kind of father who made sure Naomi never doubted that she could shine as bright as she wanted. But the world had other ideas. "Daddy, why do some people look at us funny when we're at the mall?" Naomi had asked one Saturday afternoon, after a particularly uncomfortable encounter with a store security guard who had followed them through 3 different shops despite the fact that they were clearly just browsing, clearly not stealing anything, clearly not doing anything wrong except existing while black in a space where their presence made some people nervous. Marcus had knelt down in the parking lot, looked into his daughter's intelligent brown eyes, and felt the familiar weight of having to explain racism to a child who shouldn't have to understand it yet. "Because they don't know us yet, baby girl," he'd said, choosing his words carefully. "They see the color of our skin and they make up stories in their heads about who we are and what we want. But that's their problem, not ours. Their fear doesn't define us. Our love defines us." "But it's not fair," Naomi had said, tears forming in her eyes. "No, it's not fair," Marcus had agreed. "But unfair doesn't mean we stop being kind. It doesn't mean we stop helping people. It doesn't mean we make ourselves smaller just because some people can't handle how bright we shine. You understand me?" Naomi had nodded, but Marcus could see the questions forming in her mind. Questions about why the world was the way it was. Questions about how to navigate spaces where her brilliance might be seen as threat instead of gift. Questions Marcus was still learning to answer for himself. He believed loyalty was his strength, kindness was his superpower, and love could overcome anything if you applied it consistently enough, generously enough, bravely enough. But he was about to learn that sometimes loyalty becomes weakness when it's not reciprocated, kindness becomes dangerous when it's misunderstood, and love becomes revolutionary when it crosses lines that society has spent centuries drawing in blood and fear. Neither Elena nor Marcus knew that in just hours, a storm over Chicago would force their worlds to collide in the most unexpected way. Neither understood that they were carrying similar wounds, Elena with the absence of a father's love, Marcus with the weight of being the only father standing between his daughter and a world that might try to dim her light. Neither realized that sometimes the people you're meant to save are actually the people meant to save you. Have you ever felt like you were carrying weight that wasn't originally yours to bear? Like you were building your whole life around proving something to someone who wasn't even watching anymore? The storm hit Chicago like God's own fury unleashed on an unsuspecting world. Lightning cracked the sky above O'Hare International Airport in brilliant, terrifying displays that made seasoned travelers nervous and first-time flyers gripped their armrests until their knuckles turned white. Flight 2847 to Atlanta, originally scheduled for 6 p.m. departure with typical airline optimism, sat delayed until nearly midnight, trapped by weather that turned the sky into a battlefield between wind and rain and the human desire to fly through it anyway. The terminal buzzed with the particular kind of frustrated energy that builds when hundreds of strangers are trapped together, waiting for forces beyond their control to decide their fate. Babies cried in strollers while exhausted parents tried to entertain them with smartphones and snacks. Business travelers paced the concourse, checking their phones every 30 seconds as if the weather might respond to their urgency. Elderly couples shared quiet conversations about missed connections and disrupted plans, their voices carrying the patience that comes from decades of learning that some things simply cannot be rushed. Elena Whitford sat in the departure lounge like a study in controlled elegance. Her white Armani suit remained immaculate despite the chaos around her, every crease sharp, every detail perfectly arranged. Her MacBook Pro balanced on her knees while she typed responses to emails that couldn't wait, phone calls that couldn't be postponed, meetings that couldn't be rescheduled even though she was quite literally grounded by forces of nature. But beneath the polished exterior, exhaustion was winning the war against caffeine and willpower. Elena pressed a manicured hand against her temple, fighting the headache that had been building for hours like pressure in a kettle about to boil over. The stress of closing a $12 million consulting deal with Microsoft had left her running on 3 hours of sleep over the past 2 days, surviving on espresso shots and the kind of determination that borders on delusion. Her assistant, Rebecca, had booked first-class seats as always. Elena Whitford didn't fly coach, not because she was a snob, but because first class meant fewer people, less noise, more space to think. But even luxury couldn't cure the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from building an empire while carrying the weight of childhood wounds that never quite heal. 3 rows away from Elena's carefully controlled world, Marcus Dillard was orchestrating a masterclass in patience and creativity. Naomi sat beside him, her curiosity about the storm warring with the restless energy of a 10-year-old who'd been sitting still for too long. Marcus had packed her backpack with marine biology books, colored pencils, and a journal where she documented everything that caught her attention, from the architecture of the airport to the different accents she heard in conversations around them. "Look, Daddy," Naomi whispered, pointing toward the windows where rain lashed against the glass in sheets, so thick they could barely see the runway lights. "It's like the ocean turned upside down." Marcus smiled at his daughter's ability to find wonder even in weather delays and uncomfortable plastic chairs. "Tell me what you mean, baby girl." "Well, when I read about deep-sea storms, they look just like this. All that water moving so fast and angry, like it's trying to get somewhere important but can't figure out how to get there." Other passengers around them cast looks in their direction, some curious, others less kind. Marcus felt every stare, catalogued every whisper, processed every sideways glance with a hypervigilance that comes from years of existing in spaces where his presence required justification. A middle-aged white woman in expensive yoga clothes moved seats when Naomi's laughter got too loud during a story Marcus was telling about the time he accidentally locked himself out of his apartment in his pajamas. The woman didn't say anything, but her disapproval was loud enough to make several other passengers turn and look. An elderly man with a Confederate flag pin on his baseball cap muttered something about those people when Marcus stood to throw away their snack wrappers, his voice deliberately low but not quite low enough. The words carried the particular venom of someone who believed his prejudice was patriotism. A young mother with twin toddlers pulled her children closer when Naomi tried to wave at them, as if kindness might be contagious in ways she couldn't risk. Marcus felt every cut, absorbed every slight, processed every microaggression with the practiced resilience of someone who had learned that dignified silence was often the safest response. But he also made sure to shield Naomi from the weight of other people's fear and ignorance. She was still young enough to believe that kindness was universal, that people were basically good, that the world was fair. Marcus wanted to preserve that innocence as long as possible. "Tell me about the fish again, baby girl," he said, redirecting her attention away from the uncomfortable energy around them. "The ones that make their own light." "Anglerfish." Naomi's eyes lit up with the pure joy of sharing knowledge. "They live in the deep, deep ocean where it's so dark that sunlight has never ever touched it. Like, imagine the darkest place you can think of, and then imagine it being 1,000 times darker than that." Marcus nodded, not knowing how prophetic those words would become. "And because it's so dark, they have to create their own brightness to survive. The mama fish have these little lights that hang in front of their heads like fishing poles, and they use the light to find food and talk to other fish and take care of their babies." "That's pretty amazing," Marcus said. "What happens if the light goes out?" Naomi considered this with a seriousness she applied to all scientific questions. "I think they die. Because in the deep ocean, if you can't make light, you can't survive. But you know what's really cool? They take care of each other. The mama fish protect the territory, and the daddy fish help take care of the babies, and the babies stay close until they learn how to make their own light." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. They were living in their own version of the deep ocean, a world where being black and poor and raising a brilliant daughter alone meant you had to create your own light to survive, had to generate your own warmth in places that could be cold and unwelcoming, had to shine bright enough to guide your child through darkness you hoped she'd never fully understand. When Flight 2847 finally began boarding at 11:30 p.m., the plane felt like a pressure cooker filled with exhausted, frustrated passengers who just wanted to get home. The narrow aisles became battlefields as people fought for overhead bin space, crammed oversized carry-on bags into compartments clearly not designed for them, and generally behaved like survivors of some minor apocalypse. Elena settled into seat 12A with the kind of fluid grace that comes from years of first-class travel. She slipped off her blazer, revealing a silk blouse that probably cost more than Marcus made in a week, and closed her eyes against the fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and unforgiving. The exhaustion was bone-deep now, the kind that sleep couldn't fix because it wasn't just physical tiredness, it was the accumulated weight of building a life around proving your worth to someone who wasn't even watching anymore. Marcus and Naomi found their seats in row 14, economy class, but window seats where Naomi could watch the storm and ask questions about weather patterns and flight dynamics. As the plane taxied slowly through the rain, Marcus noticed Elena 2 rows ahead. Something about her posture, the way she held her shoulders, reminded him of his own mother during her final days with diabetes. Successful on the surface but carrying invisible weight underneath, strong enough to bear anything except the loneliness that comes from having everything you thought you wanted and nothing you actually needed. "Daddy, is that lady okay?" Naomi asked, following his gaze. Marcus looked more carefully. Elena was pale, paler than she should be, and there was a tremor in her hands that had nothing to do with the airplane's movement. "I think she's just tired, baby girl. Flying can be hard on people." But 30 minutes into the flight, as they climbed through storm clouds that tossed the plane around like a toy in the hands of an angry child, Marcus realized that Elena was more than tired. She was in distress. The turbulence struck without warning, the kind that makes drinks spill and passengers grip armrests and flight attendants stumble as they try to secure the cabin. The plane bucked and rolled through storm clouds, overhead bins rattling, oxygen masks swaying, nervous laughter mixing with genuine fear as Mother Nature reminded everyone that humans were visitors in her domain. But just as the chaos settled and nervous laughter began to ripple through the cabin, something happened that transformed routine turbulence into genuine emergency. Elena collapsed. One moment she was upright, trying to steady herself against the turbulence. The next she slumped forward violently, her body sliding from seat 12A into the narrow aisle with a sound that cut through the cabin noise like a gunshot. Her Hermes handbag tumbled after her, spilling its contents across the floor: credit cards, business cards, prescription bottles, and a worn photograph of a young girl with her mother. Gasps erupted around her like a chain reaction of shock and fear. A woman in seat 10B screamed. Passengers craned their necks, some leaning forward to see, others leaning away as if distance might protect them from whatever emergency was unfolding just feet away. The reaction wasn't what Marcus expected from his fellow human beings. Instead of rushing forward to help, people hesitated. Instead of offering assistance, they offered commentary. "Probably just fainted," a man in a business suit muttered under his breath, not moving from his seat. "These corporate types, they don't eat right. Someone else will handle it." "There's always drama on these flights," another passenger sneered, more concerned with her interrupted sleep than the woman potentially dying in the aisle. "Is she drunk?" someone whispered loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "Where's a doctor when you need one?" "Flight attendants better handle this quick, I've got a connection to make." Marcus felt Naomi's small hand grip his sleeve as they both stared at Elena's motionless form. Her breathing was shallow, labored, the kind of breathing that means someone's body is shutting down whether they want it to or not. But what happened next revealed something ugly about human nature and beautiful about individual character. A flight attendant named Patricia, a white woman in her 40s with perfectly styled hair and a smile that seemed painted on, stepped forward with the kind of authority that flight attendants project when they need passengers to comply with safety regulations. But when she saw Marcus unbuckling his seatbelt, her authority took on a different tone entirely. "Sir," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the cabin noise as she stepped directly into his path. "Please remain seated until medical personnel can assist." The implication hung in the air like smoke: you don't belong helping someone like her. The message was clear to everyone watching. Marcus, a black man, shouldn't be the one to help Elena, a white woman. It didn't matter that he was the only person actually moving to assist. It didn't matter that Elena's breathing was getting shallower by the second. It didn't matter that 43 other passengers were sitting frozen while a human being potentially died in their midst. What mattered, apparently, was maintaining the social order that said some people help and some people need help, and those categories are determined by race and class and assumptions about who belongs where. The plane fell into an uncomfortable silence broken only by the drone of engines and Elena's labored breathing. 43 passengers sat paralyzed by a combination of bystander effect, social conditioning, and the fear that getting involved might complicate their own lives. Marcus felt the weight of every stare, heard every unspoken word, processed the familiar sting of prejudice disguised as protocol. This was the moment that would define not just what happened next, but who he chose to be when the world was watching. He looked down at Naomi, whose intelligent brown eyes were wide with confusion and fear. She didn't understand why people weren't helping, why her father was being told to sit down when someone clearly needed assistance, why the adults around them seemed more concerned with rules and assumptions than with saving a life. But in that moment, Marcus heard his mother's voice from years past, as clear as if she were sitting beside him. "Son, doing what's right isn't always doing what's comfortable. Sometimes being human means standing up when everyone else sits down. Sometimes love means stepping forward when fear tells you to step back." Would you forgive the passengers who turned away in someone's moment of crisis? Or would you fight for what's right even when it meant facing the judgment of people who had already decided what you were worth? Marcus Dillard looked down at his daughter, then at Elena's motionless form crumpled in the airplane aisle, her designer suit now wrinkled and stained, her carefully styled hair falling across her face like a veil. The flight attendant's words hung in the pressurized air like a challenge wrapped in politeness. Stay in your place. But Elena's breathing was getting weaker, and Marcus knew that in medical emergencies, seconds were the difference between life and death, between someone going home to their family and someone becoming a statistic in someone else's tragedy. "Naomi, baby, stay right here," he whispered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Don't move until I tell you, okay?" Naomi nodded, her small hands gripping the armrests as she watched her father step around the flight attendant and kneel beside Elena with the kind of quiet determination that had carried him through every challenge life had thrown at him. The reaction from the cabin was immediate and ugly. What does he think he's doing? Someone should stop him. Is he even qualified to touch her? This is inappropriate. Where's security when you need it? But Marcus blocked out the noise and focused on what mattered. Years ago, after Naomi's mother passed away, he'd taken a comprehensive first aid course at the Bankhead Community Center, partly for Naomi's safety, partly because volunteering gave him purpose beyond grief, and partly because he'd learned that black men in America needed to be twice as prepared and 3 times as careful to get half the respect that others received automatically. He'd never imagined he'd use that training 30,000 feet in the air on a white millionaire, while dozens of passengers sat frozen in judgment and fear. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" His voice was steady, calm, professional, the same tone he used when Naomi woke from nightmares about her mother, the same tone he'd used during those awful weeks when Keisha was dying and Naomi needed reassurance that her world wasn't completely falling apart. Elena's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Marcus quickly assessed her condition with the systematic approach he'd learned in training. Check responsiveness, check breathing, check pulse, ensure airway clearance. Her pulse was rapid but present, racing like a hummingbird's wings. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, the kind that meant her body was under extreme stress. Her skin was pale and clammy, classic signs of shock or severe dehydration. Marcus gently tilted her head to ensure her airway remained clear, his dark hands moving with practiced competence against her pale skin. The visual contrast wasn't lost on anyone watching, a black man's hands providing life-saving care to a white woman while other passengers whispered their discomfort. "Sir, I need you to step away immediately," Flight Attendant Patricia repeated, but her voice had lost some of its authority. She could see that Marcus knew what he was doing, and Elena's condition was clearly serious enough that protocol seemed less important than preservation of life. "Her pulse is elevated but steady," Marcus said without looking up, speaking to Patricia but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Breathing is shallow and rapid. She's showing signs of severe dehydration or exhaustion. Has anyone checked if she has medical conditions or medications?" The competence in his voice, the clinical accuracy of his assessment, began to shift the energy in the cabin. Some passengers leaned forward with curiosity rather than suspicion. Others looked embarrassed by their initial assumptions. Finally, a voice from the back of the plane cut through the tension. "I'm a doctor." Dr. Rachel Chun, an emergency room physician from Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, had been sitting in seat 23C, watching the scene unfold with growing disgust at her fellow passengers' reaction. She was a small woman with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much suffering to waste time on social niceties when someone's life hung in the balance. As she moved toward the front of the plane, stepping over bags and squeezing past seated passengers, she couldn't help but think about how differently this emergency was being handled than it would be in her ER. In the hospital, race and class disappeared in the face of medical crisis. Here, they seemed to be the first things people noticed. "What's her condition?" Dr. Chun asked as she knelt beside Marcus. "Pulse rapid but strong, breathing shallow and irregular, skin pale and clammy," Marcus reported without hesitation. "No obvious trauma, but she collapsed suddenly during turbulence. I've been keeping her airway clear and monitoring her vitals." Dr. Chun was immediately impressed by Marcus's competence and professionalism. His assessment was accurate, his intervention appropriate, his bedside manner calm and reassuring. "Have you had medical training?" "First aid certification through the American Red Cross, CPR certified, basic emergency response training," Marcus replied, still focused on Elena. "I volunteer at a community center. We see everything from heart attacks to overdoses to domestic violence injuries." You learn to stay calm and do what needs to be done. Dr. Chun began her own examination, checking Elena's pupils, feeling for injury, looking for signs of what might have caused the collapse. Her pupils are responsive but sluggish. Blood pressure feels low. When did she last eat or drink anything? A passenger from first class spoke up. She was working on her laptop the whole time before takeoff. I saw her drinking coffee but didn't see her eat anything. Another passenger added, she looked exhausted when she got on the plane, like she hadn't slept in days. As Dr. Chen and Marcus worked together to stabilize Elena, something extraordinary happened in the cabin. The artificial barriers of race and class that had initially paralyzed people's response began to dissolve in the face of genuine human crisis. A flight attendant brought water and blankets without being asked. A businessman offered his pillow to make Elena more comfortable. A mother with young children quietly shushed them so the medical team could work without distraction. But the most extraordinary thing was happening inside Elena's semi-conscious mind. Not fully awake but aware enough to sense what was happening around her, Elena found herself in a strange state between consciousness and unconsciousness. She could hear voices, a man's voice, gentle and reassuring, telling her she was going to be okay. She could feel gentle hands steadying her head, checking her pulse, ensuring she could breathe. Through the fog of exhaustion and dehydration, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the safety of being protected by people who owed her nothing. The man's voice was deep, calm, infinitely patient. You're safe now. We've got you. Just focus on breathing, okay? In and out, nice and easy. In her semi-conscious state, Elena's defenses were down completely. The armor of success, the walls of independence, the carefully constructed barriers that kept people at a safe distance, all of it dissolved, leaving her as vulnerable as a child. And in that vulnerability, something broke open inside her heart. "Daddy," she whispered, the word barely audible but clear enough for Marcus to hear. Marcus's heart clenched at the sound, not because she was confused about who he was, but because he recognized the longing in that single word. Even unconscious, this powerful woman was calling out for the father who had abandoned her, searching for the protection and love that money couldn't buy and success couldn't replace. "It's okay," Marcus whispered back, his voice gentler than before. "You're not alone. We're taking care of you." Dr. Chun looked at Marcus with something approaching awe. She'd worked in emergency medicine for 15 years, had seen how people responded to crisis, how families fell apart or came together under pressure. But she'd rarely seen someone who wasn't family provide this level of care, this depth of compassion, this quality of presence to a complete stranger. "You're good at this," she said quietly. "My wife died 3 years ago," Marcus replied without taking his eyes off Elena. "Cancer. I spent a lot of time in hospitals, watching people take care of the person I loved most in the world. You learn that healing isn't just about medicine, it's about making people feel safe when they're scared." As the plane began its descent toward Nashville for an emergency landing, Elena's condition stabilized. Her breathing became more regular, her color improved slightly, her pulse slowed to a more normal rate. But she remained unconscious, drifting in and out of awareness. During one of her conscious moments, her eyes opened and focused on Marcus's face. For just a few seconds, she was fully present, fully aware of where she was and who was caring for her. What she saw was a black man with kind eyes and gentle hands, a man who had risked social judgment and personal comfort to help a stranger. But more than that, she saw something in his expression that she'd never seen directed at her before: unconditional care without agenda, protection without expectation of reward, love without conditions. "Thank you," she whispered. "No need to thank me," Marcus replied. "This is what people do for each other. This is what family does." The word family hung in the air between them, and Elena's eyes filled with tears she didn't understand. She'd heard that word used in boardrooms, "We're all family here at Goldman Sachs," but it had always felt like corporate manipulation, empty words designed to extract loyalty without offering genuine connection. But when Marcus said family, Elena heard something different. She heard the same protective tenderness she'd watched him use with his daughter, the same patient kindness he'd shown a stranger who'd collapsed in an airplane aisle, the same unconditional care that she'd spent 32 years believing didn't exist for people like her. As paramedics boarded the plane in Nashville to transfer Elena to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, the cabin had transformed into something resembling actual human community. Passengers who had initially recoiled from Marcus's intervention now watched with respect and gratitude. The elderly man with the Confederate flag pin sat quietly, perhaps reconsidering some of his assumptions. The woman in yoga clothes who had moved seats earlier now approached Marcus with genuine remorse. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I was wrong to judge. You saved her life." Marcus nodded graciously, but his attention remained focused on Elena as the medical team prepared to move her. "Ma'am, they're going to take good care of you at the hospital. You're going to be fine." But as the stretcher was being positioned, Elena grabbed Marcus's wrist with surprising strength for someone who had been unconscious moments earlier. "Don't leave," she whispered, her voice carrying the desperation of someone who had spent years surrounded by people but never felt truly seen. "Please don't leave me alone." The paramedic, experienced EMT named Rodriguez who had seen every kind of medical emergency, looked at Marcus with understanding. "Are you family?" Marcus hesitated. Technically, they were strangers. Legally, he had no right to accompany her to the hospital. Practically, his connection to Elena was less than 2 hours old. But Elena's grip on his wrist tightened, and her eyes, now fully conscious and aware, held a plea that transcended social convention and legal technicality. "Yes," Marcus said quietly. "We're family." Flight attendant Patricia, who had initially tried to stop Marcus from helping, now stepped forward with something approaching shame in her voice. "Sir, I need to apologize. You probably saved her life, and I was wrong to try to stop you." Marcus looked at her with the kind of grace that comes from years of responding to prejudice with dignity rather than anger. "We all do better when we all do better. That's what matters now." As Elena was wheeled off the plane, she managed one more look back at Naomi, who had watched the entire emergency unfold with the wide-eyed attention of a child learning lessons about the world that no 10-year-old should have to learn. "Your daughter," Elena whispered to Marcus. "She's beautiful. You're a good father." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "You're going to be okay. I promise." But neither of them knew that Elena's collapse wasn't just medical, it was emotional, psychological, and spiritual. The weight of building an empire while carrying unhealed wounds had finally become too much for even her formidable strength to bear. The plane refueled and continued to Atlanta, arriving at Hartsfield-Jackson at 3:47 a.m. As passengers disembarked, many stopped to thank Marcus for his actions. Some apologized for their initial reactions. Others simply nodded with respect they hadn't shown when he first moved to help Elena. Marcus and Naomi gathered their simple luggage, a worn duffel bag in Naomi's backpack decorated with marine biology stickers, and prepared to disappear back into their ordinary life of 2 jobs and community volunteering and the quiet heroism of raising a brilliant daughter in a world that might not always appreciate her gifts. "Daddy," Naomi said as they walked through the nearly empty terminal, "why didn't people want to help that lady at first?" Marcus stopped walking and knelt down to meet his daughter's eyes. This was one of those moments that would shape how she understood the world, how she processed the reality of prejudice, how she learned to respond to fear with courage. Sometimes, baby girl, people get scared when they see something they don't understand. They see the color of our skin and they make up stories in their heads about who we are and what we're capable of. But you know what? What, Daddy? Their fear doesn't define us. Our love defines us. Our actions define us. When we help someone who needs help, we're not just saving them, we're showing the world who we really are. And you know what I saw tonight? What? I saw that when you love people without conditions, when you help people without expecting anything back, when you show up for strangers like their family, that changes people. It changes them and it changes us and it changes the world, one person at a time. Naomi nodded with a seriousness she applied to all important conversations. Like the anglerfish, right? Making light in the dark places. Marcus smiled, struck again by his daughter's ability to find profound meaning in the science she loved. Exactly like the anglerfish, baby girl. Exactly like that. But as they headed toward their connecting flight home, Marcus had no idea that his simple act of human decency had planted seeds that would grow into something neither money nor good intentions alone could have created. He didn't know that Elena Whitford was lying in a hospital room at Vanderbilt, physically recovering but emotionally shattered by the realization that she built a fortune but not a life, achieved success but not satisfaction, accumulated wealth but not worth in the ways that actually mattered. He didn't know that for the first time in 23 years, Elena was questioning everything she thought she knew about strength, independence, and what it meant to be saved by someone else. Most importantly, Marcus didn't know that Elena had made a decision in that hospital room. A decision that would change 3 lives forever and prove that sometimes the people we're meant to save are actually the people meant to save us. What would you choose if helping someone meant risking judgment from people who had already decided what you were worth? Would you step forward when everyone else stepped back? 7 hours after Flight 2847 landed in Atlanta, Marcus and Naomi sat in Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport's Terminal A, waiting for their connecting flight back home to Columbus, Georgia. It was 6:15 a.m., and the airport was beginning to come alive with early morning travelers, business people rushing to meetings, families starting vacations, and the usual cast of characters that populate airports at dawn. Naomi had fallen asleep across 2 chairs, her head pillowed on Marcus's jacket, exhausted by the overnight adventure that had turned into something much more significant than either of them had anticipated. Marcus sat beside her, drinking coffee from a paper cup and thinking about everything that had happened on the plane. He'd been replaying the scene over and over, not with pride, but with a kind of reflection that comes after you make a choice that reveals something about who you are when nobody's watching, when social pressure tells you to stay quiet, when doing the right thing means risking judgment from people who have already decided what you're worth. "Excuse me, are you Marcus Dillard?" Marcus looked up to see a woman in scrubs approaching their gate. She was Latina, probably in her 40s, with the kind of tired eyes that belong to people who work in hospitals and see the full spectrum of human suffering and resilience. Marcus immediately became protective, his body language shifting as he positioned himself between the stranger and his sleeping daughter. "Who's asking?" "I'm Dr. Patricia Williams, emergency physician at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville," she said, showing him her hospital ID. "The patient you helped on the plane last night, Elena Whitford, she's been asking for you. She wants to thank you personally." Marcus shook his head, the same way he declined recognition for years of quiet community service and everyday acts of kindness that nobody noticed or acknowledged. "That's not necessary. I just did what anyone would do." Dr. Williams sat down in the chair across from him, her expression growing more serious. "Sir, that's where you're wrong. What you did last night, that's not what anyone would do. That's what someone with extraordinary character does. And Elena Whitford has been conscious for 6 hours now, and she's told me something that I think you need to know." Naomi stirred slightly but remained asleep, her small hand still holding onto Marcus's sleeve even in sleep. Dr. Williams continued, her voice lowering to ensure their conversation remained private. "When you helped Elena, she wasn't just having a medical emergency. She was having what we might call a complete breakdown, physical, emotional, and psychological." Marcus felt that familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever someone else's pain triggered memories of his own struggles, his own moments when life had felt too heavy to carry alone. "Elena has been working 18-hour days for 3 months straight," Dr. Williams explained. "No real sleep, surviving on coffee and energy bars, running meetings from hospital waiting rooms while her assistant received chemotherapy, closing million-dollar deals while managing a corporate crisis that could have destroyed her company." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of trying to hold everything together when everything seems determined to fall apart. "But it wasn't just exhaustion that made her collapse," Dr. Williams continued. "Elena told me that 30 minutes before the medical episode, she received a phone call that shattered everything she thought she knew about her life." Marcus leaned forward slightly, sensing that whatever came next would be significant. "Elena has been searching for her biological father for 15 years, hiring private investigators, following dead-end leads, spending thousands of dollars and countless hours trying to find the man who abandoned her when she was 9 years old." The words hit Marcus like cold water. He understood that kind of abandonment, not from personal experience, but from watching what his own father's absence had done to his mother, from seeing how the hunger for a father's love could shape entire lives. "Yesterday morning, she finally found him," Dr. Williams said. "Robert Whitford has been living in Detroit this whole time, not missing, not dead, not struggling with addiction or mental illness or any of the tragic explanations Elena had constructed to make sense of his abandonment." Marcus's throat tightened. "What do you mean?" "I mean he's been married for 18 years to a woman named Patricia. They have 3 children together, 2 sons and a daughter. He's coached Little League, attended PTA meetings, walked his youngest daughter down the aisle at her wedding last year. He's been the father Elena always needed him to be, just not to Elena." The cruelty of that revelation hung in the air between them. Marcus thought about Naomi, about the fierce protection he felt for her, about the impossibility of choosing to love some children while abandoning others. "When Elena called him," Dr. Williams continued, When she finally got him on the phone after 15 years of searching, do you know what he said to her? Marcus waited, dreading the answer. He said, "I don't know why you're contacting me. I made my choice a long time ago. I have a family now, a real family. You were a mistake I've spent years trying to forget." Marcus felt anger rise in his chest, not the hot, explosive kind, but the slow-burning rage that comes from witnessing unnecessary cruelty, from seeing someone inflict pain that could have been prevented with basic human decency. "But here's what Elena told me that stopped me cold," Dr. Williams continued. "She said that when she was semi-conscious on that plane, looking up at your face, she finally understood what she'd been missing her whole life. She saw how you talked to your daughter with such tenderness, how you risked social judgment and personal comfort just to help a stranger who couldn't help you back." Dr. Williams paused, letting the weight of her words settle. She said, "I finally saw what a real father looks like. Not perfect, not wealthy, not powerful, but present, protective, unconditionally loving. I saw a man who would step into someone else's crisis without calculating what it might cost him." Marcus's eyes filled with tears he tried to hide by looking away toward the tarmac where planes were beginning their morning departures. "Elena wants to meet with you and your daughter," Dr. Williams said. "Not to thank you," she said. "Gratitude is too small a word for what happened. She wants to apologize." "Apologize for what?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse. "For living in a world where she never questioned why it took so much courage for you to help her. For being part of a system that told you to sit down when your instinct was to stand up. For having privileges she never examined, advantages she never acknowledged, opportunities she never questioned." Dr. Williams reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card with Elena's private phone number written on the back. She said her collapse wasn't just medical, it was the weight of her unexamined privilege finally crushing her. She said she spent years building an empire, but she's never learned how to build a family, never learned how to receive love without conditions, never learned what it feels like to be protected by someone who doesn't want anything from you. Marcus took the card but didn't look at it. Instead, he looked at Naomi, still sleeping peacefully despite the chaos of early morning airport activity around them. "What do you think I should do?" he asked, not really expecting an answer but needing to voice the question. "I think," Dr. Williams said carefully, "that Elena Whitford is a woman who has everything money can buy and nothing that money can't. And I think you and your daughter might have something she needs more than another business deal or another $1 million." As Dr. Williams stood to leave, she added one more piece of information that would shatter everything Marcus thought he knew about the previous night. "There's something else Elena asked me to tell you specifically. The reason she was on that plane to Atlanta wasn't for a business meeting. She was flying to meet with the Gates Foundation about donating $50 million to educational initiatives for underprivileged children, specifically, programs that help kids whose single parents are working multiple jobs to make ends meet." Marcus stared at her, his mind struggling to process the implications. "Elena was already planning to help families like yours before she ever met you," Dr. Williams continued. "But after what happened last night, after experiencing what she calls unconditional care from a stranger, she's decided to triple that donation." Marcus felt the world shift slightly on its axis. Elena Whitford just pledged $150 million to create a foundation specifically focused on supporting single parents and their children. She wants to call it the Marcus Dillard Foundation for Fatherhood and Family Support. The revelation hit Marcus like lightning, not painful, but illuminating in a way that reframed everything he thought he understood about coincidence, destiny, and the mysterious ways that human lives intersect when people choose love over fear. The woman he'd saved had already been trying to save families like his. Their collision in the airplane aisle hadn't been random. It had been destiny wearing the disguise of medical emergency. "She's using my name?" Marcus asked, still struggling to absorb the magnitude of what was happening. "She said that names have power, that legacy matters, that she wants the foundation to be named after someone who embodies the kind of fatherhood she wishes she'd experienced. Someone who steps forward when others step back. Someone who creates light in dark places." As Dr. Williams walked away, Marcus looked down at Naomi, who was beginning to stir as morning announcements echoed through the terminal. "Daddy," she said sleepily. "Is everything okay?" Marcus smiled, thinking about anglerfish in the deepest oceans, about making light in the darkest places, about how sometimes when you think you're saving someone else, you discover that they were actually meant to save you. "Everything's perfect, baby girl. But I think our life is about to change in ways we never imagined." Would you believe that some encounters are too meaningful to be accidents? That some people come into your life not because of what you can give them, but because of what they need to give you. 3 days later, Marcus and Naomi sat in Elena's penthouse suite at the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Atlanta. The view stretched across the city's sprawling skyline, a testament to human ambition and achievement that seemed to mock the emptiness Elena felt despite being surrounded by everything money could buy. The suite itself was a masterpiece of luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble surfaces that gleamed like mirrors, furniture that cost more than most people's cars, and artwork that belonged in museums. But Elena barely noticed any of it. Her attention was focused entirely on Marcus and Naomi, who sat across from her looking slightly overwhelmed by the opulence but determined to understand why they'd been summoned to this palace in the sky. Elena looked different than she had on the airplane. The expensive suit had been replaced by jeans and a simple sweater, clothes that made her look smaller, more human, more vulnerable. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of the elaborate style she usually wore to boardroom meetings. Without the armor of corporate fashion and makeup applied by professional stylists, she looked like what she was, a woman in her 30s who had everything except the one thing that mattered most. "I need to tell you something," Elena began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I've never told anyone, not even the therapists I've paid thousands of dollars to help me understand why I feel so empty despite having everything I thought I wanted." Naomi sat close to Marcus, sensing the emotional weight in the room with the intuition that children have for adult pain that's too big to hide. "When I was 9 years old, the same age you were when your mother passed away," Elena said, looking directly at Naomi, "my father walked out on us. But it wasn't just that he left. It was how he left, and what he said before he went." Elena stood and walked to the windows, her reflection ghost-like against the city lights that were beginning to twinkle in the early evening. "I was eating cereal and watching Saturday morning cartoons when I heard my parents arguing in the kitchen. My father was telling my mother that he'd gotten a job offer in another city, and he was taking it. Alone." Elena's voice began to crack with the weight of a 23-year-old wound that had never properly healed. "My mother begged him to take us with him, or to find work in Detroit so we could stay together. But he said something I overheard from the hallway, something that carved a hole in my heart that I've spent the rest of my life trying to fill." Marcus reached out and took Naomi's hand, understanding that they were about to witness someone's deepest pain being exposed. He said, "Carmen, I didn't sign up to raise a kid who's never going to amount to anything. Look at her, she's too soft for this world. She cries when other kids are mean to her. She reads books instead of playing sports. She's never going to be strong enough to succeed, and I'm not wasting my life watching her fail." The words hung in the air like physical objects, heavy with the power to shape a life, to drive choices, to create the kind of hunger for validation that can never be satisfied no matter how much success you accumulate. "I built my entire empire trying to prove him wrong," Elena continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. "Every deal I closed, every million I made, every room I dominated where I was the youngest person, the only woman, the smartest strategist. It was all just a little girl screaming at an empty chair, trying to prove she wasn't too soft, wasn't destined to fail, was worth staying for." Elena turned back toward them, tears flowing freely down her cheeks for what might have been the first time since childhood. "But you want to know the sick irony? The harder I worked to prove I was worth loving, the further I got from the kind of love that actually matters. I have $47 million, Marcus. I can buy anything, go anywhere, do anything. I have homes in 3 cities, cars that cost more than most people make in a year, art that appreciates faster than most people's salaries." She gestured around the luxurious suite as if it were evidence of her own emptiness. "I've been invited to the White House, consulted for Fortune 100 CEOs, spoken at Harvard Business School. I've achieved everything my 9-year-old self thought would prove to my father that he was wrong about me." Elena sat back down, facing them directly with the kind of raw honesty that comes when someone finally stops running from their own pain. "But I've never, not once in my adult life, felt as safe and protected as I did when you held my hand on that airplane. When I opened my eyes and saw your face, saw how you talked to Naomi with such gentleness and patience, I realized something horrible about myself." Marcus leaned forward, his natural empathy drawing him into Elena's story despite the vast differences in their circumstances. "I realized that I've never known what it feels like to have a father who would risk anything just to keep me safe. I've never experienced unconditional love from a man, never felt protected without having to earn it, never been cared for without having to prove I deserved it." Elena's voice broke completely. "I built an empire, but I never learned how to build a family. I learned how to make money, but I never learned how to make genuine connections. I learned how to win, but I never learned how to be loved." Naomi, who had been listening with the intense concentration she usually reserved for marine biology documentaries, spoke up with the clarity that children sometimes have about complex adult emotions. "Elena, did you think that if you became really, really successful, your daddy would come back?" The question hit Elena like a physical blow. Out of the mouths of babes came the truth she'd been avoiding for 23 years. "Yes," Elena whispered. "I thought that if I became rich enough, successful enough, powerful enough, he would hear about it and realize he'd made a mistake. I thought he'd be proud of me and want to be part of my life." "But he didn't," Naomi said with the matter-of-fact tone children use to state obvious truths. "No, he didn't," Elena confirmed. "When I finally found him and called him 3 days ago, he told me I was a mistake he'd spent years trying to forget. He said he had a real family now, and I wasn't part of it." Marcus felt anger rise in his chest, not the explosive kind, but the slow-burning rage that comes from witnessing unnecessary cruelty, from seeing an adult deliberately wound a child who had already been wounded enough. "Elena," Marcus said carefully, "that says everything about him and nothing about you. A man who abandons his child isn't making a statement about the child's worth. He's revealing his own failure as a human being." "I know that intellectually," Elena replied. "But knowing something and feeling something are completely different. And what I felt on that airplane, looking up at your face while you took care of me, was something I'd never felt before." She wiped her eyes and looked directly at Marcus. "I felt what it must be like to have a father who shows up. Not a perfect father, not a wealthy father, not a powerful father, but a father who's present, who's protective, who loves without conditions." Elena stood up again and began pacing, her emotions too big for sitting still. "When that flight attendant tried to stop you from helping me, you know what my first semi-conscious thought was? Even while I was losing consciousness, I thought, of course they're trying to stop him. Of course they don't trust him to help someone like me. And I realized that I was part of that system, Marcus. I was part of the reason you had to be brave just to be human." Her voice grew stronger, fueled by righteous anger at her own complicity in systems of oppression she'd never bothered to examine. "I've been living in rooms where I'm often the only woman, fighting for respect in male-dominated industries, breaking glass ceilings and shattering stereotypes about what women can achieve in business. But I never once stopped to think about the rooms where you're the only black father trying to do right by his daughter." Elena stopped pacing and looked directly at Marcus with a kind of intensity that comes from genuine revelation. "I never thought about the courage it takes just to exist in spaces where people assume the worst about you. I never considered what it means to help someone when you know that help might be misinterpreted, might be seen as inappropriate or threatening, might put you at risk simply because of the color of your skin." Marcus nodded, feeling seen in a way that was both painful and healing. "I've had every privilege in the world to heal from my father's abandonment," Elena continued. "Money for therapy, education to understand trauma, connections to build a support system, opportunities to prove my worth in ways that matter to society. But instead of using those privileges to heal, I used them to build walls. Instead of using my pain to develop empathy for other people's struggles, I used it to justify my own selfishness." She sat back down, her energy deflating as the weight of her own confession settled around her. "Here's what shame feels like for someone like me," Elena said quietly. "It's realizing that you've become part of the problem while telling yourself you were solving it. It's recognizing that your success story is built on systems that make other people's success stories less likely." Elena looked at Naomi, then at Marcus, then back at Naomi. "You didn't just save my life on that plane. You showed me what I've been missing my whole life. Not success, I had that. Not money, I had that too. You showed me what unconditional love in action looks like." She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. "The kind of love that doesn't calculate cost or risk. The kind of love that steps forward when everyone else steps back. The kind of love that sees a stranger as family, that treats a crisis as an opportunity to serve, that responds to someone else's need without asking what's in it for me." Elena wiped her eyes again, but her voice was growing stronger, clearer, more determined. "I don't want to give you money, Marcus. Money is what I've always used to solve problems from a distance, to fix things without having to change myself, to help people without having to get too close to their actual lives." She leaned forward, her eyes intense with purpose. What I want is to learn how to love the way you love Naomi. I want to understand how you turned your pain into purpose instead of letting it turn you into someone else. I want to know how you stayed soft in a world that tried to make you hard, how you chose service when you could have chosen selfishness, how you raised a daughter who believes in kindness despite living in a world that doesn't always reward it. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of Atlanta traffic 40 floors below. Marcus looked at Elena, then at Naomi, then back at Elena. What are you saying exactly? Elena took a deep breath, preparing to say words that would change 3 lives forever. I'm saying I want to be part of your family. Not as a benefactor or a charity donor or someone who writes checks and attends galas and feels good about helping from a distance. I want to be part of your actual lives, someone who learns how to be human again by watching how you do it every day. She paused, vulnerability replacing the corporate confidence that usually defined her public persona. I want to help raise Naomi not because she needs saving, but because I need saving. I need to learn what unconditional love looks like, what real family means, what it feels like to choose people and have them choose you back not because of what you can provide, but because of who you are when everything else is stripped away. Elena's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I want to be the person my 9-year-old self needed but never found. And I think maybe, if you let me, I can learn how to do that by watching you be the father I always wished I had. Have you ever realized that the person you thought needed help was actually the one trying to help you? That sometimes the people who seem to have everything are actually the ones who have nothing that matters? 6 months later, the unlikely family of 3 had settled into a rhythm that surprised everyone who knew them, including themselves. Elena had sold her $3.2 million penthouse in Chicago's Gold Coast and bought a modest 3-bedroom house in Atlanta's Virginia Highland neighborhood, exactly 3 blocks away from the apartment where Marcus and Naomi had lived since Keisha's death. Close enough to be family, far enough to respect boundaries, expensive enough to be comfortable, modest enough to be real. The transformation had been gradual but profound, like watching someone learn to breathe after years of holding their breath. Elena still ran Whitford Consulting, but she'd restructured it as a worker cooperative where employees owned equity shares and participated in major decision-making. Her first new client had been Marcus's best friend, Damon Washington, who was launching an urban agriculture initiative to bring fresh food and green jobs to Atlanta's underserved neighborhoods. Tell Elena about the bioluminescence project, Marcus said to Naomi as they cleared dishes after Sunday dinner, a weekly tradition that had become sacred to all 3 of them. They were eating at Marcus's kitchen table, not because Elena couldn't afford better, but because she'd learned that family wasn't about expensive restaurants or perfectly appointed dining rooms. Family was about showing up consistently, sharing ordinary moments, making space for each other's stories and struggles and small victories. Naomi's eyes lit up, literally, as she demonstrated the LED model she'd built for her science fair project. So you know how some fish create their own light because the deep ocean is so dark, right? Well, I've been thinking about how humans are kind of like that too. Elena smiled, remembering that first conversation in the airport when Naomi had talked about anglerfish with the same enthusiasm she now brought to every family dinner. Tell me more about that. Well, anglerfish live in places where sunlight has never ever been. But they don't just survive in the dark, they make their own brightness. And the really cool thing is that they use their light to find each other, to communicate, to take care of their families. Naomi connected a small battery to her LED model, and a constellation of tiny lights began to glow in patterns she'd programmed herself. But humans are different because we can't really make light by ourselves. We need other people to be our light. That's why communities matter. That's why families matter. Because when we're in dark places, we need people who choose to shine for us. The metaphor wasn't lost on any of them. They'd all been living in deep, dark places, Elena with the wound of abandonment, Marcus with the weight of single parenthood and systemic racism, Naomi with the loss of her mother and the challenges of growing up brilliant and black in a world that didn't always know what to do with either quality. But together, they'd created something brighter than any of them could have managed alone. The real test of their new family structure had come 3 months earlier, when Elena's biological father had reached out through her publicist after seeing news coverage of the Marcus Dillard Foundation for Fatherhood and Family Support. Robert Whitford wanted to reconnect with his successful daughter, not out of love or remorse, but because Elena's newfound philanthropy and media presence represented opportunities he might be able to exploit for his own benefit. Elena had discussed the situation over dinner with Marcus and Naomi, the way families do when one member faces a difficult decision that affects everyone. What does your heart tell you? Marcus had asked, cutting straight through the complexity to the emotional core of the dilemma. That I don't need his validation anymore, Elena had replied, her voice steady in a way that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. I don't need his approval, I don't need his love, and I definitely don't need his presence in our life. But, Naomi had added with the wisdom that children sometimes have about forgiveness, what about closure? Don't you want to tell him how his leaving hurt you? Elena had considered this carefully. I think I do need to see him one more time. Not to get something from him, but to give something back, to return the weight I've been carrying that was never mine to carry in the first place. So Elena had met Robert Whitford at a restaurant in downtown Detroit, with Marcus and Naomi waiting in the car outside, not because Elena needed protection, but because she needed to know her real family was there when she came out. The conversation lasted exactly 22 minutes. Elena had walked into that restaurant carrying 23 years of hurt, anger, and the desperate need to prove she'd been worth staying for. She'd walked out carrying nothing but clarity. I don't need anything from you, Elena had told the man who donated sperm but never fathered her. I have a family now, people who chose to love me not because of what I've accomplished, but because of who I'm becoming. I forgive you for leaving, but I don't need you to stay. When Robert had tried to guilt her about abandoning him in his old age, when he'd hinted about financial support and investment opportunities and the obligations successful children have to their parents, Elena had smiled with genuine peace. You made your choice a long time ago. You chose to be a father to other children and a stranger to me. I respect that choice, and I release you from any obligation to pretend otherwise. But I also release myself from any obligation to pretend you were a father to me. She'd stood up, left money for his coffee, and walked away from the last remnants of the wound that had driven her for more than 2 decades. When she'd returned to the car, Naomi had asked, "Did it hurt?" Yes, Elena had admitted. But it was the kind of hurt that means you're healing, not the kind that means you're breaking. Marcus had smiled in the rearview mirror. How do you feel? Like I finally understand the difference between being alone and being free. Now, months later, as they finished cleaning up after Sunday dinner, Elena made an announcement that surprised both Marcus and Naomi. I've been thinking about legacy, she said, putting away dishes with the kind of careful attention she'd once reserved for million-dollar contracts. Not the kind of legacy that gets written in business magazines or carved on buildings, but the kind that lives in people's hearts and changes how they treat each other. Marcus looked at her carefully, recognizing the tone she used when she was processing something important. When I die, Elena continued, I don't want to be remembered as the woman who built a consulting empire or accumulated millions of dollars or broke glass ceilings in corporate America. I want to be remembered as the woman who learned how to be a daughter, a sister, and eventually maybe a mother. Marcus set down the dish towel and looked at her with the kind of attention he gave to Naomi when she was working through something important. What are you saying, Elena? Elena took a deep breath, gathering courage for words that would change everything they thought they knew about their future together. I'm saying that I want to legally adopt Naomi as my daughter, not to replace you as her father, not to take away from the incredible job you've done raising her, but to give her what I never had, 2 parents who love her unconditionally. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and distant sound of Sunday evening traffic. Naomi dropped her dish towel and stared at both of them, her 10-year-old mind processing the magnitude of what was being offered. I want to give her a mother who chooses her every single day, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. A mother who shows up to school plays and science fairs and heartbreaks and celebrations. A mother who teaches her that being smart and black and female isn't a limitation, it's a superpower. Elena knelt down to Naomi's eye level, the same way Marcus always did when they needed to have serious conversations. But more than that, Naomi, I want to learn how to be the kind of person who deserves to be called Mom. I want to earn that title not because of what I can buy for you, but because of how I love you, how I show up for you, how I help you become the incredible woman I already see you growing into. Naomi looked from Elena to Marcus, her brilliant mind working through the implications, the possibilities, the ways this could transform their already transformed family. Would that be okay with you, baby girl? Marcus asked, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to keep under control. Naomi was quiet for a long moment, her serious expression reflecting the weight of a decision that would shape the rest of her life. Finally, she asked the question that revealed her 10-year-old wisdom about family, love, and what it means to choose each other. Elena, are you sure you want to be part of our family? Because we're not rich like you, and people sometimes look at us funny when we're together, and Daddy works really hard just to pay bills, and I ask a lot of questions about fish and space and why the world works the way it does." Elena's eyes filled with tears at the innocence and generosity of the question. This child was worried about whether Elena could handle being part of their world, not whether Elena was offering enough. "Naomi," Elena said, her voice breaking with the weight of love she was still learning how to express. "I've been rich my whole adult life, but I've never been wealthy until now. Rich is about money. Wealth is about love. Your daddy taught me the difference." She reached out and took Naomi's hands in hers, the same way Marcus had held her hand on the airplane 6 months earlier. "I want to be part of your family not because you need what I can give you, but because I need what you've already given me. You've taught me what it looks like to love without conditions, to show up without expectations, to create light in dark places, just because that's what families do for each other." Naomi considered this with the seriousness she applied to all important scientific questions. "So I'd have a daddy who teaches me how to be brave and kind, and a mama who teaches me how to be strong and smart?" "That's exactly right," Elena whispered. "And we'd be a real family? Not just people who help each other sometimes, but people who belong to each other all the time." "The realest family," Marcus confirmed, his own voice thick with tears he wasn't trying to hide anymore. But then Naomi asked the question that proved she understood exactly what she was accepting. "And when people look at us funny because Elena is white and we're black, we'll still be a family?" Elena felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. This beautiful, brilliant child was already thinking about the challenges they'd face, the questions they'd have to answer, the judgment they'd have to navigate as an interracial family in a world that still struggled with love that crossed color lines. "Especially then," Elena said firmly. "When people look at us funny, when they ask questions, when they make assumptions about who we are and why we're together, we'll show them what family actually looks like. We'll show them that love is stronger than prejudice, that choice is more powerful than biology, that families are built on commitment, not just genetics." The adoption was finalized on February 14th, Valentine's Day, exactly 1 year after their airplane encounter. Judge Patricia Morrison, a black woman who had handled family cases for 20 years, remarked that in all her time on the bench, she'd never seen a family choose each other so completely across such different backgrounds. "This isn't just adoption," she said from the bench, looking at the unlikely trio who had somehow become inevitable. "This is transformation. This is what happens when love becomes action, when kindness becomes commitment, when people choose each other not because they have to, but because they want to." Elena Whitford Dillard officially became Naomi's mother, Marcus remained her father, and Naomi gained something she'd never dared to dream of, a complete family built on choice rather than chance. The Marcus Dillard Foundation for Fatherhood and Family Support had grown beyond anyone's expectations, distributing over $200 million in its first year to support single parents, fund education initiatives, and create community programs that helped families stay together and thrive together. But more important than the money was the model they'd created, proof that families could be built across racial lines, class differences, and the artificial boundaries that society used to keep people separated. "You know what I realized?" Elena said one evening as they walked through Piedmont Park, watching Naomi feed ducks while explaining duck biology to anyone who would listen. "What's that?" Marcus asked. "I spent 32 years trying to prove I was worth staying for. But what I learned from you is that the question isn't whether you're worth staying for, it's whether you're willing to stay for other people. Whether you'll show up when it's hard, love when it's complicated, commit when it's easier to run away." Marcus nodded, thinking about his own journey from surviving to thriving, from protecting Naomi alone to sharing that responsibility with someone who loved her just as fiercely. "I used to think success was about achieving things," Elena continued. "But now I understand that success is about becoming someone who can be trusted with other people's hearts, someone who creates safety instead of just seeking it, someone who builds bridges instead of walls." As they watched Naomi explain the differences between mallards and wood ducks to an elderly couple who had stopped to listen, Elena and Marcus marveled at how completely their lives had been transformed by a simple choice to help a stranger on an airplane. "Do you think she understands how special this is?" Elena asked, watching their daughter with the kind of protective love that comes from choosing someone completely. "I think she understands that love is a choice," Marcus replied. "And that's the most important thing any kid can learn, that family isn't just something that happens to you, it's something you create with people who choose to show up for each other, no matter what." Would you choose love over comfort? Family over security? Growth over staying the same? The courage to become someone new over the safety of staying who you've always been? 5 years later, Marcus Dillard stood at the podium of the United Nations building in New York City, addressing the global summit on single-parent families. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had once worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on was now speaking to diplomats, policymakers, and advocates from 60 countries about the power of chosen family and unconditional love. Beside him sat Elena Whitford Dillard, co-founder of the Marcus Dillard Foundation, which had now distributed over $400 million worldwide to support single-parent families, fund educational initiatives, and create community programs that helped people build the kinds of connections that transcend race, class, and circumstance. In the third row sat Naomi Dillard Whitford, now 15 years old and preparing to speak at Harvard University the following week about her groundbreaking research on marine biology and environmental justice. She wore her mother's intellectual confidence and her father's compassionate heart like twin crowns, having grown into the kind of young woman who asked important questions and refused to accept simple answers about complex problems. 5 years ago, Marcus began his speech, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived the transformation he was describing. I thought kindness was about helping people. I learned that real kindness is about letting people help you heal. I thought strength was about carrying burdens alone. I learned that real strength is about sharing weight with people who choose to love you. The audience, diplomats, social workers, policymakers, and advocates from around the world, listened in complete silence, sensing they were hearing something more profound than typical conference rhetoric. But the most important thing I learned is this: family isn't about DNA or money or shared history or even shared culture. Family is about choosing each other, again and again, especially when it's hard. Especially when the world tells you that your differences matter more than your love. Elena wiped away tears as Marcus continued, remembering the broken woman who had collapsed on an airplane, desperate for the kind of fatherly love she'd never experienced. The woman who collapsed on United Airlines Flight 2847 taught me that we're all carrying wounds we didn't choose, trauma we didn't earn, pain that was inflicted on us when we were too young to protect ourselves. The question isn't whether you'll get hurt, you will. The question is whether you'll use that hurt to build walls or bridges, whether you'll let it make you smaller or use it to create space for other people's healing. Marcus paused, looking directly at Elena and Naomi, his chosen family who would become his greatest teachers about the difference between love as feeling and love as action. My daughter Naomi once told me that anglerfish create light in the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean where sunlight has never touched. She said humans are like that too. Sometimes our brightest light comes from our darkest places, but only if we're willing to share that light with others who are struggling to find their way. He gestured toward Elena and Naomi. This woman and this child saved my life not by giving me money or opportunities, but by showing me what I was capable of becoming when I had people who believed in me unconditionally. They taught me that healing happens in relationships, that growth happens in community, that love becomes real when it becomes choice. The standing ovation lasted 6 minutes, but Marcus barely noticed. His attention was focused on his family, on the miraculous ordinary life they'd built together through daily choices to show up for each other regardless of what the rest of the world thought about their unconventional arrangement. After the speech, the 3 of them walked through Central Park together, an annual tradition on the anniversary of their airplane meeting. Every year, they returned to airports, flew together, remembered the storm that had brought them together and the choices that had kept them together. Daddy, Naomi said as they walked past the Bethesda fountain where children played and couples shared quiet moments, do you think things happen for a reason, or do we create the reasons afterward? The question carried the kind of philosophical weight that had made Naomi a sought-after speaker despite her age, the kind of thinking that came from growing up in a family where big questions were encouraged and simple answers were suspect. Marcus and Elena exchanged glances. Their daughter had grown into the kind of person who asked questions that mattered, who saw patterns and connections that others missed, who understood that the most important truths were usually paradoxes that couldn't be resolved, only lived with. What do you think? Elena asked, using the Socratic method she'd learned from watching Marcus parent, answering questions with questions that helped children develop their own critical thinking rather than accepting adult conclusions. I think some things are destiny, and some things are choice, Naomi replied, her 15-year-old wisdom reflecting years of living in a family where love had been chosen daily rather than assumed automatically. You helping Elena was destiny. You couldn't have ignored someone who needed help, because that's who you are. Elena choosing our family was choice. She could have just sent money and gone back to her old life. And me deciding to love you both completely, even when it meant navigating questions about why our family looks different from other families, that was choice too. As they continued walking past the playground where children of all races played together while their parents watched with a kind of casual multiculturalism that gave hope for future generations, Marcus reflected on how completely his understanding of success had changed. Success was no longer about surviving or even thriving individually. Success was about creating the kind of love that rippled outward, that changed not just your own life but the lives of people who hadn't even been born yet, that proved love was stronger than fear and choice was more powerful than circumstance. Elena still ran Whitford Consulting, but she'd restructured it as a certified B corporation that measured success by social impact as much as financial returns. Her clients were now predominantly social enterprises, minority-owned businesses, and organizations working to solve problems rather than just generate profits. Marcus had transitioned from airport ground crew to executive director of the foundation, but he'd never forgotten the lessons learned from years of physical labor, community volunteering, and raising a brilliant daughter while working multiple jobs just to pay bills. And Naomi had grown into a young woman who understood that intelligence without compassion was just sophisticated selfishness, that privilege without purpose was just comfortable emptiness, that love without action was just sentiment that changed nothing. "You know what I remember most about that night?" Elena said as they approached the subway entrance that would take them back to their hotel. "What?" Marcus asked. "I remember thinking, as I was losing consciousness, that I was going to die alone. Rich, successful, accomplished, and completely alone. I had achieved everything my father said I'd never achieve, but I'd never learned how to receive love without earning it, how to be cared for without deserving it, how to be part of something bigger than my own ambition." Elena stopped walking and looked at both of them, her husband in all but law, her daughter in all the ways that mattered. "But when I opened my eyes in that airplane aisle, I wasn't alone anymore. I haven't been alone since. Not because you needed me, but because you chose me. Not because I earned it, but because you decided I was worth loving despite all the ways I'd forgotten how to love myself." Now standing at JFK Airport again, the same terminal where they'd met 5 years earlier, Marcus smiled with the kind of peace that comes from understanding that some stories end not with dramatic conclusions but with quiet fulfillment. They were traveling to Chicago for the opening of the Foundation's newest family resource center, but they were traveling as something none of them had dared hope for when they first encountered each other, a complete family built on choice rather than chance, sustained by commitment rather than convenience, strengthened by differences rather than divided by them. As they boarded their flight, first class this time, because Elena insisted that family comfort mattered, Marcus noticed other passengers around them. A single mother traveling with twin toddlers, looking exhausted but determined. An elderly couple helping each other with luggage, moving slowly but moving together. A teenage boy comforting his anxious father who was clearly afraid of flying. Everyone carries their own weight, their own wounds, their own hope for connection in a world that could be lonely despite being crowded with people. "Would you do it again?" Naomi asked as they settled into their seats, the same question she'd asked years earlier, but with the added weight of understanding everything that had followed from that single choice. If you knew everything that would happen, all the complicated conversations about race and class and family, all the judgmental looks from people who don't understand why we're together, all the legal paperwork and media attention and people wanting to turn our story into some kind of inspiration porn, would you still help her? Marcus looked at Elena, who was reading a book to prepare for their Chicago meetings, but listening to their conversation with the kind of attention she gave to everything involving their family. Then he looked at Naomi, whose question revealed that she understood better than most adults the complexity of love that crosses social boundaries, the courage required to build family in ways that society hasn't quite figured out how to celebrate yet. "Baby girl," he said, reaching for both of their hands, "I'd help her 1,000 times over. Not because of how it turned out, though I'm grateful every day for how it turned out. I'd help her because that's what love does. Love shows up when everyone else sits down. Love steps forward when fear tells you to step back. Love chooses action over comfort, service over safety, connection over self-protection." He squeezed their hands, feeling the weight and wonder of being responsible for their happiness, while knowing they were equally responsible for his. "But more than that, I'd choose to love both of you 1,000 times over. Because that's what family is. Not something that happens to you once, but something you choose every single day. Something you build with people who decide you're worth the work, worth the risk, worth the beautiful complications that come from caring about each other more than you care about what other people think." Elena looked up from her book, her eyes bright with tears and laughter. "That might be the most beautiful definition of family I've ever heard." "It's not a definition," Marcus said, smiling at both of them. "It's a choice. And it's the choice we keep making, every day, every year, every time the world gives us reasons to give up on each other." As their plane taxied toward the runway, preparing to carry them toward whatever came next in their ongoing story of chosen love and daily commitment. Marcus thought about anglerfish in the deepest oceans, about creating light in the darkest places, about how sometimes when you think you're saving someone else, you discover they were actually meant to save you right back. This was another tale from the Corex Vault, where every power story hides a human lesson about what matters most when everything else falls away. Would you have made the same choice? Drop your thoughts below. Sometimes the person you save ends up saving you in ways you never expected. Sometimes a single moment of courage creates a lifetime of love that ripples outward in ways you'll never fully know. And sometimes, in the deepest darkness of human suffering and social division, ordinary people become the light that changes everything. Not through grand gestures or heroic actions, but through the simple revolutionary choice to love without conditions, to help without calculating cost, to show up for each other when it would be easier to turn away. If this story touched you, hit subscribe. We tell true lessons of power, love, and redemption every week. Because every act of kindness is a choice to believe that love is stronger than fear, that bridges are better than walls, that families are something you build with people who choose to show up for each other, regardless of what the world says about who belongs together and who doesn't. Every choice to help a stranger is a vote for the kind of world you want to live in. Every decision to love across differences is a small revolution against the forces that try to keep us separated and afraid of each other. And every family built on choice rather than chance is proof that love is the most powerful force in the universe. Not because it's easy, but because it's chosen again and again, by ordinary people who decide that connection matters more than comfort, that service matters more than safety, that the light we create together is brighter than any darkness we face alone.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.